Okay, we've got about half the people on the call now, so I think we will just start there, otherwise we're going to overrun. So for everyone who's on the call, good morning. Thank you for joining us for this extra session outside of our usual cycle of these forums. Most of you know me, I'm Chris Dobbs, an employment solicitor here at Frettons. I'll introduce the other three panelists shortly. As those of you who have seen will know, we are using a different system today, so please do give us a little bit of credit for any technical hitches such as these ones. But as always, we're recording today's session. Your cameras and microphones are off by default, so you should just be able to see and hear the four of us. If you do manage to work out how to turn on your cameras and microphones, then firstly, please let us know. And two, feel free to do so for questions at the end, or if we pick up anything during the session that we sort of invite you to join in on. We've put together today's session because employee wellbeing is something our regular attendees and our existing clients are constantly telling us they're having to think about more and more, basically. We've done it separately from our usual cycle because rather than try to integrate this into our usual sort of sessions and do it as a presentation or a lecture, we thought a full discussion around some of the issues using other professionals with expertise in the area would be both a nice change and more useful to you. So on that note, I will introduce the other panelists. Firstly, of course, I'm joined by my colleague at Frettons, Paul Burton. For those of you who don't know Paul, partner at the firm and head of our employment team. We're also joined by Anna Harrington. Anna is founder, director and clinical lead of WHIB. Anna is a registered specialist community public health nurse specialising in occupational health. She has more than 20 years experience advising businesses and employees alike on workplace health and wellbeing issues.
Thank you.
Morning, Anna.
Morning.
Last and by no means least, we have Ezra McDonald. Ezra is a civil practice barrister at Pump Court Chambers of some 10 years cool. He has a specialist interest in employment matters at both tribunal and appellate level. In October of last year, Ezra was appointed as a fee-paid judge in the tribunal sitting in Wales. Morning, Ezra.
Good morning.
Morning to all three of you. Thank you in particular to Ezra and Anna for joining us today. The format we're following will be sort of a panel discussion. I've got a series of questions designed to facilitate those based on the comments I've had in advance from our attendees and the general queries and issues that we get from clients and of course our own experience of cases involving these kind of issues. That I think is probably going to take up most of the first hour or so. For the attendees, we do have time at the end. We've already worked out how to use the Q&A, so please do raise questions in there as we go. If one fits in nicely to the discussion, I'll throw it in. So on that note, let's get underway. Anna, I'm going to come to you first because, of course, the topic is employee wellbeing and occupational health. So I think there's a lot of misconceptions here. So I'm going to start by offending you, if that's okay, and then perhaps you can explain why I'm wrong. So there will be people on this call who are familiar with people who have the attitude I'm about to describe. And that I think sometimes is that an employee mentions they might be disabled, you're trying to get someone back to work from a long absence, and the employer should be contacting you to do an expensive referral, giving some fairly generic advice in the employee's favour, which the employer then gets in trouble for not implementing. I think you're probably familiar with that attitude yourself. Yeah, I assume your day doesn't consist of writing generic and unhelpful reports. So my question, I suppose, to start is, what does it look like and what are employers and people with that attitude missing out on from an OH point of view?
Yeah. Well, I've been doing my job 20 plus years and I absolutely love my job. The reason I love my job is because I love to be helpful. So I wouldn't be continuing in this job if I wasn't being helpful. I think the starting place really is to examine your purpose and reason for referring to occupational health, and it can be very, very useful. In fact, it's all part of my service to have a conversation, and I would suggest you have a conversation with the clinician rather than an administrator within an occupational health provider, and explore with that clinician what your current situation is. Keep it all anonymous, so don't name the individual, but describe the situation that you're currently in with that employee. It's likely to be relating to performance, behavioural, attendance issues. What you're looking for from that clinician as to whether it is appropriate to refer to occupational health. What is it that they're going to be getting out of it that's going to inform your decision-making processes? And that's what occupational health is about. It's about enabling you to make robust, fair, defensible decisions in terms of your employing that person. Some of that might be about consideration of adjustments. It's not an occupational health role to tell you whether those adjustments are reasonable or not. And I think that's another place where there's a lack of clarity. I think it's also a lack of clarity about that you get the occupational health report and people seem to feel that they absolutely must put in place precisely what the occupational health report is saying. And you know, that's not right. You should see the occupational health report as a place to start to have a good discussion with your employee. So I hope that gives a little bit more understanding and insight into the value of occupational health. I think to sum up, that starting place where I came from, having a conversation with the occupational health clinician at that early stage is really important.
And of course, it's not just kind of the OH referral at that stage, is it? People who've got that attitude that your job is just the OH report are missing out on every other aspect of what you do and the services you provide, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the core part of my role is about doing my occupational health assessments. And from that, I gain an awful lot of insight into the scenarios that are being described to me from the employer and also from the employee, and that wider context. And you know, this conversation today is not just about occupational health, it's also about well-being. And well-being is that broader context of enabling employees to realise their potential, to cope with normal pressures. You know, there's a question there, well, how do you define normal pressures? And we can debate that later. Enable them to work productively. Believe me, all employees, I will branch out there and say all employees want to be effective workers. If they don't, believe me, I'll have a lot of attitudes come to me and embitterment. There's reasons for that, of course. And also everybody actually wants to be contributing to society as well. So that role of occupational health is not just about that, you know, that single assessment. It's also looking at that broader and wider context of that workplace. What is going on in that workplace that is great in terms of well-being and what is not quite working?
Good, helpful. I think, Ezra, it's probably a sensible time to move on sort of you from that, especially from some of the things that Anna mentioned there about maybe the recommendations in particular. So obviously the natural thing that we're concerned about is what happens when it goes wrong. That's what we don't want to happen. All of us will have dealt with instances where you kind of have that classic well-being cycle, I suppose. Now stress, anxiety, depression becomes a Section 15 or a reasonable adjustments claim. From your side of things, I suppose two questions. Where else do well-being issues crop up apart from those obvious ones? And then generally, what are the risks of getting it wrong for the employer?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So I obviously endorse very, very strongly everything that Anna said. I couldn't agree more. In terms of sort of the role of well-being more generally, where might it go? Where might it go wrong? What might the consequences be? I think actually one of the areas in which well-being, and I'm talking about occupational health referrals and reports as part of the whole process, plays a significant factor we don't get to see is when cases don't get to tribunal. I think it's such an important preventative measure to engage with employee well-being at an early stage, because ultimately what claimants tend not, I don't know, Chris, Paul, you may tell me differently, but claimants tend not to approach me saying, I feel that my Section 15 rights have been violated. Rather, they say, my employer just doesn't care about me. They've showed no concern for my welfare. So the wellbeing point is a way of heading things off at the pass. I think that's where things start. It may not be where things end up, but it's often where things start. In terms of how badly things can go wrong. Well, I think there's really three ways in which wellbeing issues result in litigation. One, fairly obviously, is constructive dismissal. So the employee who feels like they are not being looked after, they are having a miserable time. Their employer knows that they're having a miserable time but doesn't do anything about it. Now, leaving aside whether there's a disability discrimination claim there, you're setting yourselves up for a constructive dismissal claim if the employee can convince a tribunal that they've been treated so badly that there's a breakdown in trust and confidence. That's point one. Point two, slightly more obvious, is disability discrimination. So Section 15 claims, someone's been treated unfavourably because of something arising in consequence of their disability. In plain English, they're off sick a lot because they're suffering from a physical illness that's long-term. Indirect discrimination claims, so they feel that they're being generally put at a disadvantage by a practice that the employer has, or reasonable adjustments, I suppose. That's the most obvious one. And again, when you're looking at a reasonable adjustments claim, and I think we'll probably talk more about this later, of course, the occupational health input is going to be essential to managing that risk. And I think the last point that I'd touch on is personal injury. And with my claimant lawyer hat on, if I'm looking to maximize the value of a discrimination complaint, I'm often looking for the possibility of an exacerbation injury, so a psychiatric exacerbation injury in particular. And that blends in very neatly to well-being issues. So an employer who doesn't look after their employees' well-being increases the chance of a personal injury claim piggybacking on a discrimination claim, and also increases the risk of, call it a freestanding stress at work claim. That could be a high court claim if you're unlucky. Chris, does that answer the question adequately?
I think it absolutely does. Paul, what I will do is come to you though, because of course you're kind of the overlap here, I suppose, or we're the overlap, I should say, of the day-to-day advice and what happens in tribunal. Was there anything you wanted to pick up on from what Rana had said there?
Yeah, both of what they've said, again, I fully agree with. And I say we're the overlap. So we on the claimant side, we get the employees contacting us, and exactly as Ezra just said, it is becoming more common that they quote law at you because, of course, our friend Google and other search engines, they look it up. But yes, in reality, they're phoning up and contacting us saying, you know, I'm very unwell, perhaps, and my employer just doesn't care, or is actually making the problem worse, even a lot of the time, from the actions they're taking. And then, of course, from the employer side, we get a lot of calls as well, where if I got £1 for every time an employer, I'm talking to them, so how long has this person been off sick? 6 months, 9 months, a year, and what have you done about it? Well, nothing, you know. And sometimes it's almost good intentions gone wrong, because they'll say, well, we don't want to be seen to be, you know, upsetting them or harassing them or stressing them, so we've just left them alone. And that's the worst thing to do. And I don't know if Anna finds that, but that's very common as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And what happens is that the employee feels abandoned. They feel isolated. They come to me and they're angry, they're confused, they don't understand, they feel let down. They will be saying to me, I've spent X number of years working for this employer and I've gone off sick and I've heard nothing from them at all. And so what then happens is that it prolongs the sickness absence. And it also is going to mean that it's more difficult for you to bring that employee back in, because what's occurred there is a fracturing of trust in the relationship. And if you have a fracturing or a shaking of that trust, automatically the employee is going to be going on the defensive, and whatever you say to them is going to be filtered through. I need to protect myself here because I don't know where you're coming from anymore, and I don't really trust you. You want to do all that you can to avoid that cycle, because getting out of that cycle is a lot of hard work. You might need to involve people like mediators as well to get that greater understanding of where each other are coming from. So, you know, in terms of long-term sickness absence from an occupational health perspective, we say 4 weeks. After 4 weeks, we suggest you actually start considering referring to occupational health. But before that time, you should have been in contact with the employee. Now, really, sorry, I can go on for quite a while on this one. Really, what you want is for your attendance policy to have a section of it saying, when you are off sick from work, we will be making contact with you. We'll be using this method of contact, usually telephone, and we will expect you to return our calls and be having conversations with us. This is from a support perspective and to keep in touch. It's not from a punitive checking up on you, monitoring perspective. It is absolutely from that point of view of empathy, support. What is it that we can do to help you in this situation and to remain in contact? Often what you find, especially in mental ill health cases, is that the employee doesn't respond. The employee goes silent. Okay. What I recommend in those situations is that you continue to try and make contact, but up it from the point of view of compassion and empathy and support, okay? And invite the employee to tell you what is the best method of having a conversation, okay? It could be actually the texting is all the person is able to cope with at that stage, that even having a telephone conversation is too provoking for them, okay?
Yeah, and of course, Anna, you mentioned the word 4 or 5 times in there. You said trust, and of course for us that's a trigger word. Ezra mentioned constructive dismissal claims there. I suppose there is a balancing act to be met there, isn't there, between the trust and confidence being you haven't bothered to contact me, you haven't done anything, and the you're harassing me trying to get me back to work.
Yeah, it's about the nature. It's about the expectations. So you've set it up already in terms of your attendance policy. Your employees know that that's what's going to happen. They also know that it's going to be coming from the point of view of that empathetic and support perspective. So this is also about line manager training, enabling your line managers to be able to have, you know, these conversations that for them might be very difficult. That, you know, the line manager could be quite worried about having that conversation. The line manager might be very frustrated because you know, they've had problems with this employee exhibiting performance behaviour or attendance issues, and actually the line manager needs to put that frustration to aside, because if that comes through in the conversation, it is going to trigger, it is going to be a difficult one with the employee.
Yeah. Okay, unless there's anything for anyone else, I think what we'll do is we'll pull back and we'll go back to kind of the topic of employee well-being itself. That's a nice big thing to talk about. We've kind of started, so let's move into it sort of properly. I think we're talking about employee well-being, Paul, from our point of view, obviously on a day-to-day basis with kind of employer clients, and Anna from your role as well. What does that phrase actually mean? Is probably a sensible question to start with. What does it mean to you? Whichever of you want to say that first.
It's a very wide subject. Well-being can mean many things, but essentially it's everyone's day-to-day mental and physical, and you could even say spiritual health. You know, it's everything. It's how they contribute to society. It's how they see themselves, self-worth. It's not just simply how they perform at work, but of course the performance at work is going to be a consequence, an outcome of their well-being. And there's probably I've probably got a lot more experience on that side of things than obviously the legal side that I deal with, but that's how I see it. What do you think, Anna?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for an organisation, it's really, if you're going to you know, really look at well-being, it's really important to define it. Often what I see is organisations going down the lines of very much an individual perspective. So they look at levels of physical exercise, they look at the eating habits of individuals, and they look at sort of sense of relationships as well. But actually we as clinicians would more say that that's about health promotion or health education. Actually, well-being is far broader than that, and it's about what I mentioned really at the start of this panel. It's about enabling your employees to realise their own potential. It's about helping them to be able to use their strengths, their personal characteristics that are great. If they're able to use their strengths, they're going to be working for you really well, and they're going to love working for you. The work for them is actually going to be sort of easy. It's natural, and I don't mean easy in the perspective that there isn't any challenge there, because we as humans, and part of well-being is about reasonable challenge. So reasonable challenge is about enabling the person to gain and to stretch and to develop, but within an amount that they believe that they are able to do, and the support structures are there as well to help them do that. Within sort of the workplace, you know, I also mentioned earlier about normal pressures, and that does link with what I've just said there in terms of the ability to stress, to stretch. What can happen in terms of giving employees pressure is that it tips over then into stress. And when an employee is stressed, that's when you will start to see underperformance. So, yeah, so well-being can also mean that a person is living well, but they do have a diagnosed ill health condition. So that kind of is not, it's irrelevant. You know, somebody could have a diagnosis of bipolar, they could have a diagnosis of rheumatoid arthritis, but to them, if you ask them, how do you feel in terms of your health and your well-being, and they could very well say, I'm really great, I'm really happy, I'm thriving, I'm doing what it is that I want to do, and I'm using my personal characteristics and strengths in order to do that, and I'm valued for doing that as well.
And also, it can be the other way around, can't it, Anna? It can be the other way. So it can be the other way. You can be as fit and healthy physically and have no sort of diagnosable mental health issues, but you talk to someone and they could be like, oh no, I'm really struggling to get out of bed to go to work because, you know, the opposite from what we were saying.
I'm so pleased you brought that up, because, you know, so you have all of these exercise programs going on, and often I'm told by employers that they're doing all these things for well-being and amazing and wonderful stuff, and they're spending a huge amount of money on it, but their employees are not very happy. You go, well, yeah, you can be the fittest person in the world, but that doesn't mean you're going to be happy. It doesn't mean
it does
that you're
help,
going to be great. Well, there's nuances in there. It might not help.
Yeah, and I suppose, Ezra, drawing on what Anna and Paul were just talking about, that distinction that they're drawing there is almost very much the difference between the constructive dismissals and the disability claims, isn't it?
Yeah, indeed. And I suppose that if I circle back to the involvement of occupational health in this, I just wanted to pick up on something that Anna was saying about employers using the occupational health report as a starting point rather than an end point, rather than taking it uncritically. Because when I was thinking about the content of this discussion, I was having a little dig around in the case law, and there's a really nice little line from, gosh, who's it from? It's actually the lay panel members in an appeal, which is quite rare, and it's the case of Donnellian. And what they said is this: they said it will normally be expected that a tribunal will look for evidence that the employer has taken its own decision as to, is the employee disabled, are they not disabled? It's going to work the same for other things the employer might have to decide, like reasonable adjustments, like what workplace measures do we need to control our employees' well-being, what things can we do to monitor employees' well-being, things like that. In doing so, the lay members sitting with me in this case, me as the president of the appeal tribunal, would wish to emphasise that in general, great respect must be shown to the views of an occupational health doctor. But any view expressed by such a doctor should not be approached uncritically. That's just another way of saying the occupational health report is super, super important. It's always going to be this, well, almost always going to be the starting point. And if you don't have your in-house occupational health team, then you will look to outsource. And woe betide the employer who says, well, we didn't do anything about occupational health because we didn't have an occupational health team in-house. That's never going to be an excuse. But it's not a rubber stamping exercise.
Yeah, I again love that, Ezra, and it's another thing I invite the people who refer employees to me to do, is to have a conversation with me after the receipt of the report. I can only talk about the report content, but please have a conversation with me. It helps you to gain that clarity on that report content. You know, a lot of my clients are very small businesses, so it's very rare that they're going to be using me more than once within, for instance, a 6-month period. So getting familiarity, for instance, with the way that I phrase things, it's also an opportunity for you to talk with me about what you are thinking about the next stages and how are you now going to approach your employee. So ring your occupational health person up and have a conversation with them after the receipt of that report as well, to gain that greater clarity.
Yeah, and I think it's from our point of view, and Chris has probably seen this as well, it is very important. We do often see employers who will, quite, confidently say, oh, well, we've done an occupational health report, we've got an occupational health report, we've done it, we've done everything it says in it. And they just think that's it. Then they don't. What Ezra was just saying, they don't actually then make their own decision. They try and hide behind the occupational health report, and that I've seen cases where they get unstuck because of that. So it's a really important thing, but as you both said, it's got to be backed up by the employer using, because at the end of the day, it's the employer and the employee who knows exactly better than anyone else the working environment, the colleagues, the relationships. With all due respect, the four of us from the outside are never going to know that as well. So they've got to make the decision ultimately, and a lot don't.
Yes, that's right. And that again, brings me on to, there's a lot of fear, really, I think, is the reason why they don't make decisions, or, they won't contact an employee for a long period of time. And again, that's why picking up the phone and having the conversation with the occupational health specialist will help you. We're there as a support service for you.
Yeah, so let's explore that process a little bit. And Paul, I obviously know the answer to this a little bit, but I'll come to you as the panelist. Because that's what you're here for. The point at which we're advising an employer client and we say, you know what, this is where you need to be speaking to OH. What sort of triggers? I know we mentioned obviously the period of absence earlier, but what sort of circumstances or any triggers for you that say, you know what, this is beyond me, this is beyond the remit of what internal HR should be deciding, go and involve OH?
Yeah, so the first one is perhaps the obvious one. The one is when someone is off on long-term absence, and like Anna said, we dovetail with the 4-week period. However, I think it's important to say that's the obvious trigger, but by no means the only one. And Anna's already said earlier, you should be making contact earlier, and there's nothing wrong with contacting occupational health literally from day one of the absence if it's appropriate, or indeed if the person's still in work. And I think that's the one that we do see, and I often have conversations with. The person is still coming into work, or they're still working from home, but the employer will say, well, yeah, but their performance is down, and we know there's something going on in their life, but we're, you know, they're not really talking about it. That again, that's a trigger. That they don't have to be off sick to be a trigger, and that happens a lot of times, I think.
Absolutely. Performance issues. So for instance, not being able to complete the same volumes of work, not following process, they're making errors at work, for instance, inputting information incorrectly. Those are all performance issues that I suggest you pick up on very, very early, and you pick up on again from that point of view of exploring. So you're not picking up looking to disrupt the employee in terms of sort of from a punitive perspective, but you're exploring as to the reasons why. What has gone on here? It could be a health reason, but it might not be. It might be an equipment reason. It could be relating to software. It could be relating to training. So yeah, really early on, as soon as you spot those performance issues, pick up on them and respond to them. Behavioral issues as well. So for instance, the person is breaking down in tears. Maybe they're non-communicative, they've gone silent. It could be that they're more irritable. It could be that they're not turning up for meetings. Any signs like that, have a conversation. Same conversation as I talked about in terms of performance. It's an explorative conversation that you're approaching them with, you know, trying to understand where they're coming from. What is it that is causing these problems? If it's a health issue, you might want to start to explore, is occupational health appropriate to bring in at this stage? But like I say, it could very well not be a health issue at all.
So a question I've just had come on the following that, and I think Ezra, I'll cut across you because I'm going to come to you to answer it, and you can answer what you're about to say at the same time. Can it be too early? And the question that's come through is, if you're referring to occupational health and you say, we've noticed A, B, C, D about this person, are you building towards implied knowledge of a disability there that you might not want?
Short answer is no and no. I think bluntly, there's unless you think the referral to occupational health is going to be entirely pointless, I don't think it's ever too early to make the referral. And the reason I say that is because for the forms of disability discrimination that we see most commonly, so Section 15, discrimination arising, and failure to make reasonable adjustments, there is a test, a get out clause for the employer if the employer shows that they did not know and could not reasonably have been expected to have known that the employee was disabled. That's for Section 15 claims, or for reasonable adjustment claims, both that the employee was disabled and was likely to be put at the substantial disadvantage that they're complaining about. So the key question is, what could the employer reasonably have been expected to know? And if the employer hasn't bothered to seek some input from occupational health, with my claimant lawyer hat on, I've got a really easy point in cross-examination, which is, look, if you'd made the referral to occupational health earlier, you would have known. So that then leaves the employer fixed with what we call constructive knowledge. So they could have known, but they can't do anything about it because they did not in fact know. So I think the failure to refer to occupational health leaves you in this nasty position where you might be liable because the tribunal thinks you could have found out if you tried, but not able to do anything about it because you don't have the right knowledge. You haven't got that input from occupational health. So that's why I say no to both of those questions. No, it's not going to be too early to refer. And no, I'm not worried about imputed knowledge, because if we're talking about constructive knowledge, you're going to have it whether or not you make the referral. And the thing you need to make the decisions is going to be actual knowledge. That's my tuppence.
That's the answer I was expecting as well, which is always a good sign. Did you also have something you wanted to follow up from what Anna was just saying, or is that by the by now?
So I think I wanted to make one point that was sort of related to what Anna was saying, but it's slightly tangential, and it's still really on the theme of employers making their own decisions, I'm afraid. So talking specifically about reasonable adjustment, thinking about, well, when is an adjustment going to be a reasonable adjustment? And the answer, rather than hopefully from the tribunal's perspective, is, well, it's all just fact specific. It's an objective question that the tribunal's got to look at. Was this an adjustment that is reasonable in the circumstances? But, and there's always a but. That's two buts here. One is, it's worth looking at the list of factors in the EHRC statutory code of practice, a super useful document that I commend to everyone, not just lawyers, not just occupational health specialists, but also employers and business owners. It sets out some of the following factors that you might think about when you're looking at whether an adjustment was reasonable, and those include whether the adjustment would work, the practicability of the adjustment, the costs of the adjustment, the amount of money that the employer's got, so the resources that the employer's got, the availability of external funding, sometimes a relevant factor, and the type and size of the employer. But I would add to that the input from occupational health might also be a relevant factor in considering whether the adjustment was reasonable in the circumstances, because we know that the employer's policies can be a relevant factor. And the other point I make is this: once your OH report has said, here are some adjustments you could make, then if this goes to tribunal, that's what the employee is going to start with. These are adjustments that could have been made. So I would have thought the default position always ought to be not just take your OH report seriously, but have a really good think about implementing the recommendations in that report. Chris, I think that was slightly tangential, but that's my follow-up.
It was helpful, and I think we'll probably come back to it, because what I just want to pick up on is the question that you might all be able to see in the Q&A, coming back to the topic of how early it can be. Occupational health referrals during a probationary period. We had the question whether it can be too early. I suppose that one is, I suppose it's the reason that you want to finish the probation, isn't it?
Yeah, would during the probationary period be too early? No, it wouldn't, not in my view. The bit you want to be twitchy about is anything pre-employment, because as we all know, you're tightly constrained in what you can ask about pre-employment. But during the probationary period, no, it's sensible. And in fact, it's doubly sensible, because during the probationary period, you're not going to get hit with a claim for constructive unfair dismissal or unfair dismissal. What you might get coming down the pipeline, if you're not careful with it, is a claim for discrimination for which there is no qualifying period. And how to manage that? Answer, well, if there is a need for OH involvement, get OH involved.
Yep, I don't think there's any disagreement from Paul or Anna there, so hopefully that answers the question. Do let us know if it doesn't, and if anybody wants to follow up on that. Where should we go? Let's kind of go back to this life cycle of the OH referral then. Anna, back to you. The OH referral's been made, perhaps, I don't know, it's a return to work scenario, for example. That first initial contact with you and perhaps the referral itself, what is it helpful for you that businesses have already thought about, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so they're clear about the reasons for considering occupational health referral from the point of view of their business perspective. So going back to the performance, behavioural, attendance issues, I would have expected them to have already had a conversation with the employee, especially around the behavioural or performance issues. I would also like them to have had a conversation with the employee about their health, but recognising boundaries and recognising confidentiality and respecting that. So from an occupational health perspective, it's ideal to have some knowledge of the health reason. We understand that you might not be able to give us that, and that's fine. In terms of the occupational health referral, one of the most difficult situations that we do encounter is the employer has put into that referral performance issues. Then in my assessment, the beginning stages of my assessment, I go through that referral with the employee. I tell them what's in it. Not infrequently, the employee says, stop, I knew nothing. I knew nothing about that. And boom, we've gone into defensiveness, we've gone into confusion, we've gone into, you know, the person being very let down and disappointed. So you must have the conversation with the employee before referral about the reasons for that referral and give them an opportunity to explain themselves to you.
Yeah, that's helpful. I suppose, Paul, Ezra, moving into kind of the litigation stage of it, I've seen it, I'm sure you've seen it. You get this report that comes through, it's vague, it's non-specific, and we can only assume that's come because the employer hasn't asked the OH specialist the questions they should be asking.
And
yes,
Chris, just to, sorry.
Go on, Ezra. Sorry.
I was going to add in a couple of sentences at that point. So at the point at which the referral is made, I think it might be worth giving some thought to not only what questions you want OH to address, but also the basis on which the employee is going to be talking to OH in the first place. So, for instance, is there an agreement in advance this information is going to go back to the employer? Is all of the information going to go back to the employer? Is any of this material going to be confidential? Because that's going to make a difference further down the line.
Yes, yes. So often occupational health providers will give the employer an employee guide to occupational health services, and within that guide it will explain to the employee about confidentiality. Now, in terms of that report content, at the end of the assessment phase of an occupational health assessment, the clinician will give the individual an overview of that report content. And they will also give the employee an opportunity to see that report before it is sent to the employer. There are certain circumstances where even if the employee says to me no, I will say to the employee, actually, I think you need to see this. For instance, it's particularly sensitive, the relationships at work are difficult. So yes, and we work with employees. If employees are hesitant about some of the content of that report and what we're wanting to put into it, we will work with employees to understand why they're hesitant. We will explain to them why we think it's important that the employer needs to know this information, and we'll work with the employee at maybe rephrasing it so the information is still given, but it's given in a way that the employee is able to accept. So there are, in terms of a consent process for occupational health assessments, I describe it as 3 stages of consent. But I'm probably taking the conversation off somewhere else, so I'll leave it there.
Stay there if you want, unless Paul, Ezra, you had anything you wanted on the topic. Otherwise, carry on, Anna, by all means.
Okay, 3 stages of consent. So the beginning stage is actually the employer stage. So you're talking with the employee about the reason for the occupational health referral. What is it that you're going to be putting into the referral form? And does the employee consent for you doing that? Then when I receive the referral form, I will check all of that information, go through, have the assessment. At that beginning stage of the assessment, I go through the referral form. I explain to them what an occupational health process is about. So what questions, you know, an overview, what am I going to be asking about? What's going to happen in terms of my opinion? It gets written into the report, and I tell them at that early stage that they can see sight of it. And then I ask them, are you all right to continue? So that's the second stage in terms of a consent. And then the final stage is at the end of that assessment, which I've already explained, which is about that report content. Do I have your consent to send this report to these referring people? The referring people are the people that are named on that referral form. I cannot and will not send it anywhere else. And I will not have any conversations with anybody who is not on that named as a referring person on that referral form. As a clinician, we have very strong codes, professional practices that we have to adhere to, as well as legislation. So yeah, the other thing I'd say about consent is that at any stage the employee can withdraw that consent as well. It does happen that an employee doesn't give me permission to send that report. I work hard with that employee, because my objective always is to be helpful. And I believe that if the employer doesn't get my report, it's not going to be helpful in this situation. I work hard at getting that report out and to the employer.
Anything from Paul, Ezra, to follow up on that?
Not so much on the consent, but going back to doing the referral itself. From our point of view, Chris, from the getting the contact from employer clients, I see it's not just that they don't ask the right questions, but they don't put them in the right context as well. I don't know if Anna sees this when she receives them. So in the past, when I've talked to many employers and they're talking about making an occupational health report, and then when I see if they try and do the referral themselves, yes, they might ask some of the right questions, although they often don't, but they also don't put the context of those questions. What I mean by that is they won't explain in enough detail the environment the person works in, the role that they carry out, perhaps the relationships they have. But that's all as part of the referral, and as Anna said, it's all kept confidential. The more information the employer can give, not just on the question side, but on the context side, I would hope would give Anna and occupational health specialists much more information to work with, and therefore hopefully easier to do the report and be helpful.
There's certainly a balance to be found there, and we need to respect obviously GDPR and sending of relevant information and the appropriateness of sending that information. So and for an employer not to be seen that they're influencing the occupational health clinician as well. So it is actually a tricky one to get balanced. So what I would say is that I don't want the notes of any meetings. I don't need to see, the real detailed conversations that you've had. But what I do want to know is that you have had a conversation with the individual, for instance, on the reasons why they're not performing as you want to do. Or for instance, I want to know that you have tried to resolve the relationship issues, but I don't need to see the detail of those conversations at all.
So going back to that question of consent, we've had another question come through, and I assume this is kind of after what you would call your third stage, Anna. What happens if the employee still refuses there? Because I suppose that makes a problem for you being helpful, a problem implementing, and then ultimately, to do this as a three-part question to Ezra, where does that leave the employer in terms of a defence later?
I mean, the employer can only then manage the situation with the information that they have available. But I would argue that the employer coming out to occupational health, paying for my service, facilitating it, it's a lot of work that actually they've done as much as they can reasonably be expected to do. But I'll pass this now on to Ezra and hear about, you know, the law perspectives and courts, how they would take that.
Yeah, so I think if the employee, and this is why I asked about disclosure at the point of referral, if the employee is going to say, I'll talk to occupational health, but I don't want any of this information at all going to my employer, then does the employer end up with constructive knowledge of the employee's condition? I think almost certainly not, on the basis that the employer in tribunal will say, we could not reasonably have been expected to have known that the employee was disabled or that they were going to be placed at these disadvantages. And our best evidence is that the employees themselves, when we got a professional to talk to them about these issues, refused to tell us, the employer.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a helpful position to take, because ultimately, as you say, knowledge is going to close that bar. If they don't know about the disability, they can't be expected to handle it. It really is that simple.
It's important to make sure that, you know, the occupational health service has tried to work with the employee to find out why don't they want that report released, and what is it that they can do to enable that release. So it's not just taken as a, oh, the employee didn't give consent. You know, it's explored and worked upon.
Yep. Oh, there you go. Another interesting question on that. I assume it's an overlap of the two answers we've just had. Would that also apply if your OH is in-house?
Yeah, absolutely no difference.
Yeah, shouldn't that be the case? Okay. So I suppose, Ezra, let's pick up on that and revisit the point you were making earlier, which I suppose is the arguments of what has legs in terms of we didn't introduce this recommendation and what doesn't.
Yeah, so I think my default position is, if you're not going to introduce a recommendation, you'd best have a good reason for doing so. And then the question is, what's that good reason going to be? Of course, the employer gets to take their own decision as to, is this a reasonable adjustment? So it is a managerial question rather than a question for occupational health. That having been said, if occupational health say this chap or this lady need a phased return to work no more than 3 days a week in the first instance, I really struggle to see what employer could override that and say, no, we're going to get them back full time because of operational need. I think they'll be on a hiding to nothing doing that. Cost issues, well, cost issues really are a managerial point rather than an occupational health issue. So it may be that the employer can override on the grounds of cost, on the basis that it's the employer that knows about the cost of the measures and the consequences of the measures. Now, I suppose the other point is to do with effectiveness. So there may be situations where actually the employer knows more than occupational health. I'm thinking in particular about cases where the employer has tried to manage an issue previously, but the management steps that have been taken haven't worked. So, for instance, suppose the employer has got an employee who struggles to work full time. The employer has tried offering them 3 days a week. The employee hasn't managed with that and has still gone off sick for extended periods of time. Employee gets sent to occupational health who doesn't know about the previous trials with 3-day weeks, and occupational health come back saying, try a 3-day week. Could the employer reasonably reject that recommendation? Answer, yes. Why? Because the employer's tried it and knows it doesn't work. Apart from those relatively exceptional cases, I would tend to defer to, not uncritically, of course, but I tend to defer to occupational health in terms of the recommendations that are being made. I think that's the safest option.
Can I just put something to that, Ezra? I agree with all that, but on that last one, wouldn't an answer be from the employee side? looking at it from the employer, we shouldn't, as part of the occupational health referral, and Anna might be able to say something about this as well, shouldn't they have at least said to the occupational health, well, we have tried a 3-day week. So going back to that point earlier about subject to GDPR and sensitivity and that, you should be giving the OH enough information, so they should already know that that person do 3 days a week. So yeah, I take your point, but you could almost criticise the employer in that scenario, hypothetical scenario, because of that.
You could, and I think you would as well, because it would go back to the issue of knowledge. You'd be saying what could the employer reasonably have known? Well, if the employer had given occupational health the adequate information, then they would have found out more, wouldn't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we do. If you've already tried to put in place adjustments, then giving us an idea of what those adjustments were is really, really useful. It does mean then that your report back is going to be more value to you as well, because we're not just going to repeat what you've already done. Or we may very well come back and say, actually, we can't recommend any further adjustments. We don't know. I'm sorry at this stage. I would also always guide employers to look at access to work. So access to work is government funded agency that is there to give financial assistance to implement some adjustments in the case of disability as well.
Okay, so we are just coming up to the end of the first hour. I've gone through pretty much all of our questions that we knew about in advance, as it were. So I do have one mop-up question for each of you at the end, but I will just see if anybody on the call has got anything specific they want asked or any particular questions about anything that's been discussed first. So if there's any other questions, just to give you 3 time to think, what I'm going to ask you in a minute is the one takeaway message from each of you for today on employee wellbeing and OH.
Chris, whilst we're waiting for any audience questions, as it were, there's one point that I think we raised in discussions prior to this talk. I don't think we've touched on.
Sure.
Which was to do with the issue of common failures in relation to wellbeing and occupational health. And I've got a couple of comments on that. Would it be helpful if I
be my guest? Please do. Yeah.
So really two points, I think, and one of them has already been dealt with by Anna, which is to do with engagement with occupational health and understanding why it is that the adjustment in question is being proposed. So it's not enough just to get a list of proposed adjustments and say, well, let's do numbers 1 through 8, but not 9 through 10. Rather, if you've got a list of adjustments that relate to, for instance, reducing extraneous volume, reducing extraneous lighting in the workplace, you might also start thinking, well, why are those adjustments needed? Do we also need to think about reducing other extraneous stimuli? And the second point was going to be about lack of communication. In terms of where I see failures in tribunal in relation to these issues, quite often I think they stem from lack of communication between the employer and occupational health. And that means the report doesn't make its way to line management, or the report makes its way to senior management or middle management that then doesn't get fed down to the individual's direct line manager. Or going the other way around, there's simply not enough information going from the employer to occupational health, because it's the line manager that sees the issues. It's somewhere up in middle management that the referral actually gets made, but by the time that happens, that sort of first-hand information has been lost. So I think those are really the two areas that I see most room for improvement at the moment.
Yeah. So that brings up a brilliant point, which is about who should make the occupational health referral and who should those referring people be. I suggest the line manager, involving human resources as well. And in terms of who gets the receipt of the report from me, the line manager, and human resources, you can have your own internal sort of consent phase where if you need to share that report, for instance, with more senior managers, then you've got a process to gain that consent from the employee in order to do so.
Yeah, and actually that comes to a useful point on a question that we've just had through the Q&A. Anna, I'm not going to ask you to sell anybody else, but the question is recommendations on how to find suitable OH when it's not in-house. What pointers should people be looking for on the assumption they're not going to use you, by the sound of it?
There are actually a number of HR Facebook groups. So you can ask for a recommendation for an occupational health provider within those Facebook groups, which is very useful. They can also use the Society of Occupational Medicine. They have a list of providers on their website as well. There's also an organisation called COPA. They have a directory of a list as well of occupational health providers, and the other source is an organisation called Simply People. Nearly went then. Simply People also have a database of occupational health providers. But you're really looking for that recommendation. You know, who is the right occupational health provider for you? So that's why I recommended actually if you're a HR person and you can get onto the HR Facebook groups, you can ask in those environments, in those circles. You can put a question. I've seen them out on LinkedIn actually. Can anybody recommend an occupational health provider? So you can get recommendations that way as well.
Yep, so I'm sure we'd all agree with you that the personal recommendation is always the best. It's exactly how we all work.
Yeah.
Okay, so coming back, I suppose, then to that wrap-up question, the sort of takeaway message from each of you, either on employee wellbeing, the role of occupational health, or the message and your role in it generally. Who shall I pick on first? Who wants to go first then?
I don't mind going first.
Go on then, Paul.
My takeaway, and it's something I talked about earlier, it is be proactive, and it also links to the communication line as well. So going from our point of view as the first port of call when things possibly start to go wrong, or often have gone completely wrong, is that what I said earlier, is that communication earlier. Employers will often be reactive way down the line, far too late. So my takeaway is, if anything else, make sure, you know, as soon as some of the things Anna said earlier, behavioural, performance, you know, just out of the norm things going on with an employee, be proactive, you know, don't be afraid to talk to them and communicate. Yeah, that would be my one.
Yep, who's next?
I think mine links really well with Paul's, which is about make sure that your line managers are trained in knowing how to manage people, not just from the process perspective, but from the human perspective. So about how to have difficult conversations, how to be able to listen, how to respond appropriately. And then support your line managers. Being a line manager is an incredibly difficult and demanding job. Provide them with the amount of time that is required and provide them with that ability to have mentorship or buddying schemes so that they can develop and learn in the role as well.
Yeah, brilliant. Ezra?
My take-home message is going to be early engagement, and I know that's much like what Paul just said, but I think it's fundamental. Early engagement avoids problems. Don't worry about the issue of knowledge. If the tribunal is going to find that you could have known, could reasonably have been expected to have known, then they're going to find that whether or not you've actually gone to occupational health. So why not go to occupational health and get the actual knowledge that you can then act on?
Brilliant. I think it's the message we almost always have for everyone, isn't it? It's communicate. The more you communicate, the more these things are going to be addressed early, the less likely you have a problem. Okay, so we've got a couple of follow-up questions that have come in while you're giving those, so we'll just take some time and run through these, answer them however you want. First one, if an employee is taking medication and receiving counselling for a condition, the example they give here is ADHD, can it be useful to refer to OH for further support?
Interesting one. Okay, so neurodiversity. Talk with your occupational health provider. Now, my take on this is often, but not in all circumstances, it is best to go for very specialist neurodiversity support. And I have two organisations that I generally will refer my employers to, and they're called Lexic, so L-E-X-X-I-C, and Genius Within. And the reason for that is because it's very nuanced and very specific and highly specialised. It would be unusual for an occupational health professional to have that level of knowledge and expertise to be able to do that. Now, I said, but not in all cases, because often with neurodiversity, you get accompanying it mental ill health. And that's entirely appropriate for, I mean, it's about 80% of our work is mental ill health. In that, it might be a dual referral there to the neurodiversity and occupational health as well.
Yeah, so yeah, in effect, you're not a substitute for specialist medical expertise. It's
No.
you're making ultimately, which I think important whether we're talking about neurodiversity or any other condition, of course.
Yeah, and again, any good occupational health provider will tell you what their limitations and boundaries are and be able to guide you where to go.
Yeah, excellent. And the other one, of course, I think we should have expected at some point, stress at work absence in relation to occupational health. How do we sort of treat the stress at work absence situation?
Refer as early as possible. And in addition, get onto the HSE website, onto their tools and templates for stress management and do the stress risk assessment.
Yeah, what's causing the stress is the question, isn't it? Pedro.
I think I'd also say, look, these things always get difficult because if you've got an employee who is off with stress, they will often not want to be contacted. They will see the employer trying to keep in touch as harassment. I think it's important not to be scared off trying to keep in touch with the employee, who is off sick. If they are not ready for a face-to-face meeting, which they may not be, send an email. If they don't want a phone call, send a letter. If they can't cope with correspondence, then try a phone call. See if they've got someone else that they can communicate through. That's another option. But the employer isn't prevented from managing sickness just by the employee's unwillingness or inability to engage with it.
Yeah, and Paul, I remember this was one we talked about when we did it last year, I think. Ultimately, this is the employer's situation, it's the employer's business, isn't it?
It's one, and it goes back to what I said earlier about, some employers have the fear of exactly what Ezra was just talking about, but no tribunal is going to criticise an employer, I hope Ezra will agree, if they said, well, yes, I'm not saying you contact them every single day, but on a weekly, fortnightly, monthly, whatever again, what Anna said earlier, you manage expectations, you try and agree up front, but no one is going to be criticised, even if the employee turns around and says, well, no, they were just exacerbating the situation by trying to communicate with me.
Okay, another one. Do you anticipate difficulties assessing long COVID and reasonable impact on performance?
Yes.
That was an easy one. Next.
Okay, well, how much longer have we got? All right, so actually it's a quite specialist area for me. I worked with the Society of Occupational Medicine in long COVID. Your biggest issue really with long COVID is the standard phased return to work typically is 4 to 6 weeks. Long COVID doesn't fit into that. Long COVID is notoriously difficult because it's a fluctuating condition that can also bring new symptoms to the fore, sort of, you know, later down the line that weren't exhibited. So it's what employers absolutely hate, which is it's unpredictable. The most common work impacting symptoms are going to be around fatigue and brain fog. So brain fog is the ability to concentrate, focus, make good decisions. Those are going to be majorly impactful on work performance and on work attendance as well. It is difficult.
And I'm not aware of a case yet, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but we haven't had a test on whether it's a disability in law yet, have we?
I don't think we have, but actually I suspect, strongly suspect, it's all going to be fact specific. So just look at the test in Section 6 of the Equality Act. Is it going to be a physical or mental impairment? Yes. Substantial adverse effect on normal day-to-day activities? Almost certainly. And then the battleground is going to be over long term. In other words, is it likely to last, which we know means may well last, at least 12 months? And well, if it's already lasted 12 months, you're going to tick the box. If it's someone who they look ill, they're not getting better, is that going to be enough to convince the tribunal that it's likely to last 12 months? By analogy with depression, probably not until you hit about the 9-month stage. And by the time you hit 9 months, you might be inviting the tribunal to draw an inference that since it's gone on for 9, it's probably going to go on for another 3, probably. And that, of course, is going to change as we get more medical opinion on how long COVID, in fact, lasts for.
Yeah, it's a really difficult one for occupational health. We are asked the question, we're usually asked as to whether the Equality Act applies, or sometimes even the DDA, and we return back saying that's a legal decision. But what we can give you an opinion on is whether they are impaired, whether those impairments are substantial, whether without treatment they are likely to be long term. And we always refer to our medical evidence, and I'm sorry, we haven't got that medical evidence yet to say clearly that yes, this is going to be long term. So it was interesting, Ezra, I've not heard that point before about the 9 months being used in courts. That's really useful to hear that. That's valuable for us, occupational health, when we're trying to establish that our opinion on guiding that employer to consider it or not as long term.
Yeah, not a hard and fast rule, but in depression cases, you will tend to find that the employee presents as depressed and that they're not getting better, but at the point at which things start to go badly wrong, they've only been depressed for a period of 6 months. And absent an expert bit of evidence saying the prognosis is 1.5 years, 2 years, what have you, the tribunal has got to form its own view as to whether the condition's likely to last 12 months. And the employer's got to ask itself, is this condition likely to last 12 months? And the case law seems to suggest that at the 6-month stage, that's going to be too early. But by about 9 months, the tribunal can draw those inferences. And it's all fact specific. Realistically, if a tribunal does draw that inference, the appeal tribunal is unlikely to interfere with it.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I've run out of questions from attendees, so unless any of you have got anything you want to add as a final point or anything you wanted to revisit. Oh, hang on, no, never mind. Right, if an employee starts with an organisation and doesn't declare a disability, so obviously this is pre-work checks, and then mentions an existing mental health condition to a colleague, do you refer to Occ Health? What's your take on that?
Well, it's not a problem if they're not exhibiting any issues at work. So, you know, so what if they've told a colleague that they have long-term depression? What does that mean in terms of You know, if they're working well and their attendance is great, doesn't matter, does it?
Yeah, I'm inclined to suggest, oh, there you go, but they're struggling with their work. Well, in that case, yes, presumably this goes back to, yeah.
You talk to the employee first, wouldn't you? You know, that's the, you know, you discuss the situation with them as a line manager.
Yeah, you've got to do that, but of course it's a very difficult situation, isn't it? Because you think, okay, so did that person tell the colleague in confidence, and then the colleague has told the line manager, and now we've got a difficult relationship.
It's a management question, isn't it? You've sort of got to go, let's address this as a performance issue and leave them to raise the reason, I think.
Yeah.
I was going to say, if they're struggling at work, there's going to be other indicators, flags for the line manager. So they're not going to hopefully go to that person and say, oh, so and so has been talking about you. It's going to be, we've noticed you're struggling with X, Y, and Z. Do you want to discuss it further? Is, you know, why that's the case? So I would think, Anna, isn't it? It's asking open questions, isn't it? And asking the employee to invite.
Yeah. So preparing before that conversation. So prepare your physical environment, but also prepare yourself in terms of your own headspace. You've got to create sort of that time within your own mind to be able to sit and listen, and any sort of difficult emotions that you have arising, that you're able to manage those emotions so they don't imbue that conversation that you're having with that individual.
Okay, right. I feel like I need a bell to do a last call or something here. Any last questions before we finish, anybody? No. Right. I think I'm going to call that then. Okay. Anna, Ezra, in particular, thank you for joining us. I think that's been really insightful. I think it's helped a lot to have your involvement on this as well. Paul, you were here.
I'll have a chat with him after, don't worry.
It's all right, that's my appraisal failed. Okay, attendees, again, as always, thank you for joining us, of course. I've got no idea how to end this call, so I will leave you to leave on your own. But yeah, Anna, Ezra, as always, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, everyone. Take care, everyone. Bye.